Hello, welcome to Madrona's Pulse Teachings. I'm Iris J. And today, this topic I'm talking with you about is befriending Saturn. Befriending Saturn, letting go of some of the stereotypes that we have learned about Saturn. But the first disclaimer I'm going to have is that how Saturn gets read in astrology is really dependent upon the type of astrology that an astrologer is practicing. So I practice evolutionary astrology that's woven in with cultural theory. And this is going to change how I interpret Saturn and how I work with Saturn in my practice and with my clients. And this is important. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I want to talk about the archetype a little bit. I want to talk about what Saturn represents when we're looking at archetypal astrology and how the archetype is really helping us to come into claiming and healing within our own journey through our psyche. And then I will go through the houses kind of quickly to just show some insights into where you might be working with these themes throughout your whole life. Okay, we're always emerging and growing with Saturn. So even if we think we have the greatest Saturn boundaries when we're 20, I will guarantee you that when you're 40, they're going to be different. Okay. And so the first disclaimer I want to make, though, however, especially if there's some of you that are going to jump to see wherever your house Saturn is that astrology is never a one size fits all. Okay, so these types of videos where you see Saturn through the house or you see something through the signs, they're really useful at learning the archetypes and getting insights into some themes that might come up. However, if you have Saturn sitting next to your sun in the second house, that's a very different Saturn than someone who doesn't have the sun there. Okay, so your chart matters. Always the plug to work with an astrologer and learn all the different ways, but they're great for learning the core archetypes. Okay, so first let's just kind of talk about Saturn. Okay, so the first piece to make really clear is that in my practice I don't work with malefics. Okay, so whereas someone who's coming from Hellenistic astrology kind of has divisions of planets into traditionally good and challenging or good and bad planets, where Saturn would be a malefic planet. Now, this makes sense, okay? It makes sense, especially that our view of astrology shifts and changes because our view and understanding of the world shifts and changes. And just looking at the archetype of Saturn is wonderful for that, because at one point Saturn was, the furthest planet that we could see with the naked eye, the furthest planet that we at one point believed was part of our solar system. And then, as we know, humanity's creative scientific pursuits evolves, and our way of viewing the world evolves, and how we will view the world 100 years from the moment I'm making this video will be completely different than it is right now, just like it is then hundreds and thousands of years ago. And so what's really interesting about that is that Saturn itself is the archetype of the boundary between the known and the unknown world. This is why Saturn represents our boundaries in our own body, our boundaries in our psyche, our boundaries in our life, and the boundaries of what is known and unknown. I'm going to talk about the word boundaries a lot because that is the core Saturn archetype, especially when it comes into kind of reclaiming and claiming and moving on these journeys that so many of us are trying to move on, more authentic journeys. When we're working with Saturn, that has everything to do with boundaries. But just interesting to see that this planet that kind of rules the boundary of what is known and unknown, it also has to evolve in how we view. Okay, and so what are the traditional ideals of Saturn are that it kind of represents this external authority figure, often male, most often white in the ways I've seen it depicted. So this white male authority figure that is going to really make our life difficult. And then we're there because we need to suffer and we need to work harder. Saturn's going to make us work harder. And then we're going to finally prove ourselves and we're going to be valid. What are we going to be valid in? Well, we're going to be valid in what is at its core a colonial, capitalistic, white-centered idea of meaning. Okay? This is not the way that we need to make meaning. Saturn does not need to, Saturn is part of our archetype no matter what. And we have come from traditions that are interpreting it in terms of a very patriarchal lens. Work harder and you'll have more meaning. Work harder and you'll have more value. That's the traditional Saturn interpretation. However, I would like to befriend Saturn, and that is definitely not someone that I this isn't to say that, and immediately you can hear someone being like, well, then you're lazy, or like, we are working with a new paradigm. And this view of astrology is about how we are all here on our individual journeys, okay? Who I am has everything to do with my ancestors. It has everything to do with the type of childhood I had. It has everything to do with whether or not my parents had money to feed me. It has everything to do with all these layers of meaning. And our journeys are very, very individual in that sense. And they are always part of an interconnected, collective way of being in this world. And astrology is about helping us to recognize both, to embrace an authentic soul journey from the idea that we are here to have certain experiences, to heal certain experiences, and to become more and more authentic to what our soul is here to sing in this life. Okay? And for me, and most of the people I meet, that means throwing off some pretty harmful ideologies that have created a very unsustainable world, emotionally, psychologically, and materially, and in terms of climate. And they have to do with the way that we interpret the archetypes, which has everything to do with patriarchy. So this idea of befriending Saturn is really about getting to the core of the archetype. Because to hold something as good or bad, that is a patriarchal archetype. That is an idea of a sense of self that is modeled after those who have power, where those who have certain types of power determine what is good and what is bad. And if you do this like I do it, the white male way, then you'll be good. And this, unfortunately, dominates a lot of archetypes in astrology. But it's also the system of meaning making that we've come out of. And now we can evolve past that. And when we do that, we can reclaim so much. We can reclaim the archetypes, but when we do that, we reclaim parts of ourselves, whole parts of ourselves. And Saturn is a beautiful, nourishing energy. Okay, first of all, it is actually an energy that's aligned with more of a yin archetype, which is not the active male principle. It is the receptive principle. Okay, so right there, we kind of see this way that a stereotype of this like angry man who's making us work harder is actually working with an archetype that is by its nature yin, that is by its nature receptive, that is receiving so that effective boundaries can be formulated so that we can thrive. That's what Saturn is helping us to do. Form boundaries so that we can thrive. And when we look at our chart, it's suggesting the place in our life and our psyche where having those boundaries is most likely going to be really important. And it's not going to be easy. There's probably going to be some struggle there. But that's part of the lesson of life, is learning these boundaries and evolving with them and shaping our life in new ways. Okay, so I'd really like to explore the softer side of Saturn. That doesn't mean that life doesn't have struggles. Of course, life has struggles. Somewhere along the line, we kind of got this idea that if we just check all our boxes, everything will be a happy Disney fairy tale. And that was a product of a patriarchal capitalistic society that was keeping a few people in power. Okay, letting it all go, coming into the spiritual waters of self and psyche in which there is no, this is good, this is bad, but there is an ongoing journey of healing and learning. And Saturn is such a big part of that. And so where we have Saturn is where we're going to want to work on boundaries. And boundaries are not an easy thing. Okay, anyone that's done a bit of therapy knows that boundaries are not an easy thing. And I think it's actually even more confusing to talk about boundaries in our very abundant social media, pop psychology, pop world, because there's really limited kind of like one size fits all lessons about boundaries out there. And it's like, I know my truth, go F off. That person looks like this, they're not coming. It's like these really rigid boundaries. And remember that yin receptive energy. The boundaries are actually supposed to shift with us. Remember that shoreline. They shift as we're shifting. What I need for myself in boundaries when I'm 22 is going to be very, very different than when I'm 35. It's going to be very different than when I'm 50, because our sense of self, our sense of authority is shifting. And the reason that Saturn is also all about boundaries is because it's helping us to claim our authority. That's part of the archetype. And in this way, other planets like Saturn and Pluto are really big in this way. Yes, as we're on journeys, especially in our youth and early adulthood, of learning what it means to be with our authority in a very confusing world, we can often have external figures emerge and kind of play out dramas with us. And the idea of here from an archetypal psychology lens being that that's part of this kind of energetic matrix in which we are learning about our own internal authority through this challenge that's emerging with someone external. The idea being that as we reflect on that, we can learn more and more about our own internal boundaries. And you know what happens when we have really healthy boundaries? The drama in our life just goes away. Like Grey's Anatomy, that show wouldn't have made it past the first few episodes, okay, if their characters had really healthy boundaries. Because when you have really healthy boundaries, you don't make really, really poor choices that create a tidal wave of toxic impact for everyone involved, like having sex with partners in broom closets and this and that. The bulk of our TV show, the bulk of pop world culture in terms of this is about characters that don't really have strong boundaries. Strong being nurturing for themselves, okay? And that's when drama, and that's when we get into drama in our real life too. And that's kind of part of the maturing process, is that, we start hopefully having a bit less drama as we start cluing into our boundaries. And that's what Saturn is really helping us to do. Again, from the spiritual idea being that by doing that, we're actually learning to live on our own shoreline between the known and the unknown much more comfortably. And that is going to ripple out and radiate and really impact our life in all different ways. And so just again, that Saturn does not need to be this kind of male authority figure that is there to teach us to work harder so that we can be validated in someone else's eyes, in another ideology's eyes. It can be about us claiming our own boundaried self, our own needs, our own internal divine timing, in our own authority, so that we work in a way that is meaningful to us. And that right there is changing paradigms. That right there is creating community out of people that are coalescing and working in ways that are meaningful in shared values, and not just because there's this one old, outdated external idea of what success should be. And Saturn is all tied up in these ideas of success and hard work. And so as we're shifting these paradigms within society, astrology can help us see where we can do that within our own psyche. And that's what our chart is all about. So here I'm going to go through the signs pretty quickly, okay? Just kind of picking up some key aspects that, if you have Saturn in your 6th house, then you can skip ahead to the timestamp and see what it means if you have Saturn in your 6th house. And again, just remembering that if you have a packed 6th house, that's going to change what Saturn means, but some of the archetype is definitely going to be there, okay? And there will be another video at another point for Saturn through the signs. So Saturn in the 1st house. Okay, here, theme of identity, claiming a sense of a boundaried self-authority in identity. Who am I? That's a big question. If you have Saturn in the 1st house, Not a question that you're necessarily going to answer. You're probably going to answer it in your elder years. Sorry for the spoiler alert. But it's a question that's here to fuel you. And a question that's here to really, Saturn in the first house, part of what I'm here to do is work on my authentic sense of self, my authentic voice. So not giving my power away to others, okay? And especially in our younger life, there might have been some power struggle around that. You might still have power struggle around that because it's a really hard, big lesson, but it's a lesson that Saturn in the first house is here to work on. So really developing, really doing some what we call somatic work and really learning like your body's boundaries, because our body is always talking to us about our boundaries. Like when we have a pit in our stomach, or when we're suddenly feeling a sense of anxiety, that's our body talking to us and saying, maybe I need to rest, or maybe I shouldn't be at this social outing, or learning to talk with your body is part of instilling some really important boundaries and really inviting some excitement around befriending your self-authority in your identity. Saturn in the first house. Moving on, if you have Saturn in the second house. Okay, Saturn in the second house, house of resources. Okay, this is a Saturn placement where there's really an invitation and a request from the soul and psyche to have a strong self-sufficiency. Okay, these are resources that are, yes, it's money. It's also our emotional resources, our psychological resources, material resources. But when we have Saturn in the second house, there is a sense of self that wants to be able to develop and have a strong sense of security that comes from my self-sufficiency. Okay, this is probably going to be a theme throughout life. Again, these are themes that we're revisiting, we're evolving, we're kind of taking 2 steps back, jumps forward. But it's something that's coming up, is that there needs to be strong boundaries in my sense of self-authority, because this is the grounding. Second house is the grounding that we build our life on. Okay, so this is where there's kind of a strong not giving power away to others to build your life for you, claiming that, and doing the work so that you have the boundaries that you want, which is the infrastructure of your life that you want. Saturn in the third house, house of communication and house of small communities. Saturn in the third house, communication is so, so important. It's a theme throughout life. Okay, being able to communicate to others about your needs and wants is going to be part of building all the essential boundaries for your life. Okay. Especially if you didn't have a childhood where, communication was something that was really nourished for you, even just going through the public school system can sometimes limit that. It's really important to actually learn to communicate with yourself so that you can communicate with others in an effective, nourishing manner. Here, journaling can be really important. There's nothing like journaling that teaches us how to communicate with ourselves so that we can then communicate with others. But communication is just a big theme. It's probably going to be part of helping you to do the work that you want to do in this world, whatever that work is. Saturn in the fourth house. Here we are talking about the house of home, the house of family, and the house of our own psyche. So, on the first basic level, Saturn in the fourth house, it is really important to have very nourishing boundaries in your home, especially if the home that you grew up in did not have those boundaries. Here, part of life work might be building a safe home for yourself, building a nourishing, nurturing home for yourself. And that might take a while, depending upon your early experiences, depending upon all the situations in life. But it is part of the call for your psyche is to build that safe home. The reason being that you're actually being called to go explore that psyche. The boundary of the psyche. We're talking Saturn in the fourth house is deep, folks. There's no way around it, because we're actually talking about the boundary of like what's known and what's not known within the psyche. And there's a part of you that wants to explore those realms within yourself. The idea being that by building that safe home externally, you can build a safer home internally so that you can do all sorts of adventurous journeying in your psyche. Okay, so that's also calling for some pretty internal journeying with Saturn in the fourth house. But again, that external home is important to facilitate that. Saturn in the fifth house, here we have the house of creative self-actualization. You have Saturn there. This is really a call to work on establishing your self-authority, especially in whatever ways it impacts your creativity. Okay, this is not looking to an external realm or external validator to say that your creative work is meaningful. It's not looking to celebrity culture or to whoever's trending as an influencer. It's really inviting that strong, empowered sense of self to come from within. It actually comes in the fifth house. It actually comes from your spirituality and your connection to the divine. And then it's like it's giving you this really stable ground, really boundaried self to approach your creative projects. Okay. It's also the house of children and romance. But the reason it's the house of that is because of the creative energy that's present in romance, that's present when we're with young children. So it's really inviting a sense of self-authority into your creative outlook, into your creative voice, however that manifests for you. Sixth house, Saturn in the sixth house. So this is a strong placement in terms of if you have Saturn in the sixth house. So this is the house of daily living. It's the house of health, because our health comes from our practices of daily living. The sixth house is the house of the mind-body connection. So if you have Saturn here, it's really, really important to have very grounding practices every day. So whether that's meditation or whether that's some physical activity, it's so important that you are doing something daily that's connecting mind and body and that's helping you come into a state of relaxation, because Saturn in the sixth house can be a very hardworking Saturn. This can be a very hard work ethic, however that manifests for you. It doesn't have to manifest in traditional work ways, though it might. But it just means there can also be a lot of pressure on yourself that comes from yourself here. It's a hardworking Saturn placement. There's no way around it. That's why it becomes really important to rest, to make sure that you're eating and drinking enough water. Like the basics are really important with that Saturn placement, because it might carry you really far. Like if you want to make a business for yourself or whatever it is that you want to do for your plans, Saturn in the sixth house will help you do that. You just have to remember to take care every day. Saturn in the seventh house. So Saturn in the seventh house, this is the house of relationships. So relationships are going to be a theme for you in your life. And Saturn there, the thing about the seventh house is that it's not actually about the other person. Of course, it's about the other person because we're in a relationship with them. And this is all one-on-one relationships. It might be your intimate partner. It might be business. It might be clients. It's wherever one-on-one relationships show up. And they're actually really important because they're how you learn about yourself. And they're how you learn about the boundaries that you need for yourself. So if you have Saturn in the seventh house, like most likely there's going to be some times when you're leaning too far, taking care of others, or you're pulling back and not actually offering enough of others to have a fulfilling enough to others to have a fulfilling relationship. That's just part of the learning. And Saturn in the seventh house is trying to call you in to that sweet spot where you're really like you're giving and receiving in a flow. And of course, we can't stay there forever, but that's really important because it's part of building a ground in this life for you. And so those relationships are going to be teaching you about your boundaries, because that's what relationships do. Okay. Saturn in the eighth house. Here, a theme that's coming up is really strong self boundaries. Why? Because this is the house of merging completely with others. It's the house of merging intimately, whether that's with a intimate sexual partner, whether that's with a deep friendship, or whether that's with spirit itself, whether that's with a ideology. It's the house of mental health because we just flow into these waters of merging and going beneath the surface. And so when you have Saturn here, there's a call that your psyche really wants actually a grounded sense of self to go and do that work, to go and do that bounding. It's potentially giving you quite a bit of stability in your relationships with others, whether that's, financial bonding that happens in a business, or whether that's just the relationships that you have in your deep partnerships. But there definitely might be some learning here in terms of power struggles and what it looks like giving too much or taking too much power. But again, like in the seventh house of relationships, Saturn's calling for a sweet spot of give and take. Here you're looking for a sweet spot of I can really be grounded in myself and deeply merge with this other person. And it's a bit of a paradox, but it's something that your psyche is working on throughout your life. And it's also it's a place where you find power. Okay. So being in very intimate relationships in one way or another might be very important to you, but you're not wanting to lose yourself completely in those relationships. You're wanting to have a stable, grounded sense of self there. Saturn in the ninth house. So ninth house, we are having a Saturn that is really asking us to feed our desire to learn, desire to grow intellectually, to feed the imaginative spirit within. Saturn in the ninth house, this is the house of higher education. This is the house of learning. This is the house of traveling and exploring other cultures and other ways of knowing. And with Saturn here, that is definitely a very important to feed that. Here, there's really this ability to learn so much. There's an ability to learn so much about other ways of knowing, about different cultures, whether that happens from book studying or going to a traditional university program, or becoming a teacher in that way, or comes from kind of a non-traditional study by just going out and traveling the world. It doesn't matter how it happens so much as it happens. This is also, a house where you might really be attracted to teachers. There's this authority of teachers with Saturn in the ninth house, keeping in mind that at some point you're being asked to take on that teacher role. So it's not just giving your power to other teachers, though they may have, strong mentors might be important in your life. But at some point, you're being asked to take that role on with Saturn in the ninth house, because that's that boundaried sense of self. But here the boundaries are really about different ways of knowing. Okay, it's a very creative energy, and claiming that kind of teacher voice within yourself, whatever that looks like. Okay. Saturn in the 10th house. So Saturn in the 10th house, this is actually the home of Saturn. And if you have Saturn in the 10th house, then there's a strong emphasis on work out in the world. Okay. It sometimes is traditionally read as career. It could just be your reputation, the work that you want to do working with others. It doesn't have to be a career, but just how you move through this world. It's definitely a house in which we are seen in the world. And there's a desire to be seen in the world in a certain way. It could be in a big way. It could be in a small way. It could be in your local community. It could be out on the world stage. But Saturn in this world wants to do work that is contributing to the social collective. Okay, so whatever that means for you, wherever your passions take you. And again, it's not giving away authority. Okay, with Saturn in the 10th house, you want to be careful about giving away authority to others. That might have been part of learning how you're going to move through the world. But at some point, you're the leader. Okay, you're working with others, but you're part of the team that's building the collective world stage. Again, that could be in a big way or that could be in a small way, but that Saturn voice wants its authority. It wants to be its own ground as it's moving and it's connecting with others. Okay, Saturn in the 10th house. Moving on to Saturn in the 11th house. Saturn in the 11th house, here we are talking about bigger social networks. We're really entering a transpersonal way of being. So here, even though Saturn is about our personal boundaries, If you have Saturn in the 11th house, your personal story is part of a bigger story. Your personal story is part of creating systems of meaning, whether that's on social technologies, and whether that's in the internet, or whether that's out in the world and building businesses or building community or doing work in your local community. Even just work with friends and the way that friends build community. Your sense of internal timing, your sense of being a boundaried being, is to actually create form for the networks that are much bigger than you. Okay. You have a gift of being able to bring form to these kind of big social networks in a way that is really important. Okay. So it's about learning to trust that authority within yourself so that you can do some work out in community. And last house, we have Saturn in the 12th house. So Saturn in the 12th house. So here we're talking about the house that's actually about being in the ocean. It's about the unconscious. It's about all that is beyond the day-to-day and the known. And you have Saturn there. So you remember that I described Saturn as kind of that shoreline. So there's a bit of a paradox here because you're the shoreline in the ocean. Okay. So one thing that becomes really important with Saturn in the 12th house is that you cultivate time to be with yourself. Saturn in the 12th house can actually show up. There can be a bit of kind of existential loneliness, knowing that that's nothing that's wrong with you. That's nothing that needs to be cured. That loneliness is actually asking to be a gateway into deeply meditative experience. Okay. The 12th house is a very spiritual house. So if you have Saturn there, you're being asked to actually learn the gift of meditation, whatever meditation looks like for you. There's so many different ways, right? But actually of coming into a relationship with spirit. And and that will feed, okay? Connection with spirit is what feeds any loneliness that the 12th house can manifest. The reason being as well, with Saturn here, you actually have a gift. You have an ability to actually create some structure out of that which is structureless. The idea being that with a placement like this, that you can create that structure for others, whether that's teaching or writing or making art, but it's showing the way that we can create structure out of that which is infinite, so that others, not just you, but others can access that 12th house of mystery, that 12th house of all that is beyond the day-to-day world. This is also the house that rules all the parts of society that we kind of push aside. So whether that's prison systems or students with disabilities, like folks with placements in the 12th house can end up working with those folks who are on kind of beyond the bounds of the daily meaning making, because you have an ability to create meaning in that place. It's something to be nourished, and it's something to be trusted and worked with. Okay. And that takes us through our journey through the houses. So again, quick insights, just to feed you some thought to think about. And I'm going to leave it with that. So thanks so much. Please subscribe if you're still listening. Please subscribe and like and all that YouTube stuff. And I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.